and welcome to the Giving Voice to Depression podcast. I'm Terry, the creator and co-host of this podcast. I've lived with depression most of my life, and I know how easy it can be to feel all alone in the experience. I'm not alone, and you aren't either.
And I'm Dr. Anita Sands, a licensed clinical psychologist with a number of my own diagnoses, all of which bring a certain amount of anxiety and depression along with them. There is great power in shared experiences. We share our own as we engage in intimate and candid conversations with our weekly guests, exploring different perspectives on and experiences with depression.
We keep it real because depression is real. We keep it hopeful because there truly is hope, in spite of what depression tells you. This podcast is produced in partnership with Recovery.com. Recovery.com provides resources and information for individuals seeking treatment for mental health or addiction issues. Its website is a fact-checked and vetted online platform of treatment centers to help individuals find the right path to recovery. This episode is sponsored by the A.B. Korkor Foundation for Mental Health. Hello, Anita.
Hi, Terry. You know, one of the most frequent questions that we're asked when people learn that we co-host a mental health podcast is, where do you find your guests? Today's episode is a perfect example of why that answer is everywhere, because that's where you find people who are willing to discuss depression and suicide and mental health in general. When you open the door and make it clear that you're open to and safe to have these conversations with.
Mm-hmm. So I was in a drive-through line, and the truck in front of me had a big sticker on its back bumper that said, #check on your friends. And I was staring at it thinking, that has to be a suicide prevention message. So after the driver pulled to the side to wait for his order, I pulled beside him, tapped my horn, rolled down my window, and waited for him to do the same, and then I asked him about it.
He replied that he had lost a good buddy by suicide and that his friend's mother made these stickers to encourage needed conversations that could help prevent future suicides. He also said that she makes herself available to support her son's friends by having those conversations with them when needed. We asked him to reach out to her and see if she'd be interested in being our guest and sharing her story, and she was. So here is Jeannie giving her voice to depression.
One of the things we often hear from parents who've lost a child by suicide is that people hesitate to bring up their child's name, as if doing so would remind them of their loss. They never forget. Sharing a memory, a story of how you were impacted by their child's life, or any other comment or conversation related to how they lived versus how they died, is generally appreciated. Having learned that, we began our conversation with Jeannie by asking her to tell us a bit about her son, Jake Pasamato.
He was the youngest and the second child. He was a brilliant child. He was reading by the time he was 3, anything you put in front of him. He knew his math facts. He was like a sponge. He could be somewhere else in the house and something would be on TV and he'd hear it and he would literally suck it all in. He was the kid who was reading so well that in kindergarten, he wanted to read to the class. And he said to his teacher, "I just want to give you a break. You look really tired today." And wasn't allowed to read to the class. And he just couldn't understand that. But that was Jake.
That was Jake, flexing his biggest muscle.
From the time he was a little kid, had the most compassionate, huge heart. And he carried that with him throughout his life.
Jeannie says Jake's mind was also impressive. Whether tackling a car engine or academic test, he could just look at it, figure it out, and put the pieces together. But very unfortunately, his gifted brain was also his nemesis.
Jake struggled all of his life. He was 7 the first time he talked about the world being too heavy and that he couldn't carry it. He didn't like it. He felt the world was angry and mean. And, he was already in therapy at the age of 7 and shared that with his therapist. And as he got older, he would tell us very, very bluntly that the day would come when he knew he just wouldn't be here anymore because it was too much.
Jake was just 7 years old when he told his parents and therapist that the mean world was too heavy for him to carry. For reference, 7-year-olds, usually first or second graders, are still losing their baby teeth. Typical developmental milestones include having a solid sense of time, understanding seconds and minutes, days and weeks, solving simple math problems using objects like counting beads. Most can use a pencil to write their name. Jake had witnessed and analyzed life and found it to be unbearable.
And I think that Jake was an old soul that internalized the weight of the world. Not only his own anxieties and depressions and worries, but everybody else's. If somebody else was hurting, it was nothing for Jake to pick up the phone and say to us, so-and-so is struggling and can't pay their rent this month. Can we help them out? Or just so you know, I used my bank account to buy my friend, whoever, groceries because, they can't get themselves out of bed. They're really having a hard time. Wow. That was just who Jake was.
Depression and anxiety were his early diagnoses. Years later, it would be bipolar disorder.
I think he was 22 or 23 when we had a full-scale evaluation where they did, they did an intellectual evaluation and they did the whole psychiatric evaluation for him because we were trying to regulate his medication. So, and I remember the psychiatrist who did the evaluation said, I have never met anyone as uniquely in touch with their own abilities, disabilities, how it impacted him. She absolutely loved working with Jake. And she really found it fascinating how his brain worked, not only intellectually, but emotionally.
It is necessary to acknowledge and remember the gifts, strengths, and beauty of the lives our loved ones lived. Because when they leave us, especially by suicide, that single act can become others' focus.
I remember distinctly the last time that I talked to him, the night that he decided to leave, and we had talked on the phone and he was very grumpy. And, I got off the phone and I texted his best friend. He'd lived in Portland, Oregon when he passed away. And I told his best friend, I said, can you please reach out to him? He's really struggling. I'm a little worried about him. And unfortunately, they didn't connect. And so, and I think that was by choice on Jake's part, not to answer the phone.
Parents of adult children, perhaps especially those who battle depression and other mental health conditions, know that sometimes they go dark. They don't pick up or return calls or texts. And we can't go into full panic mode every time because that wouldn't be healthy for them or us. But sometimes intuition and experience tell us this time feels different.
And the next morning, I couldn't get a hold of him. He had asked me to please, try to help him get up. He had moved and needed to get a new driver's license because he had just gotten a new job. And he didn't answer the phone. And I was worried.
Jeannie's husband, Jake's stepfather, said Jake had been working overtime and was probably sleeping in. He suggested that Jeannie go for her morning walk.
So I went out for a workout. I did a power walk, and I was about 5 minutes from home. And I could hear the song Rocky Mountain High by John Denver playing really loudly, and that was one of Jake's favorite songs. And I'm looking around thinking, who on earth is playing that so loud at 8:30 in the morning? And my dad died 10 weeks before Jake. And I said, I don't know, right out of the blue, I said, Dad, I need to know if Jake's okay. And as crazy as it seems, there was my dad and Jake right in front of me, both of them, arms around each other's shoulders. And I knew in that moment that Jake was gone.
And with your dad.
Yeah, my dad was there to welcome him. I fully believe that. And it was like a hologram, and it kind of twinkled away, and the song went away. And that was that.
Jeannie went home. She and her husband called the police where Jake lived and asked them to check on him. Their worst fears were confirmed.
And it was the most, like, it's going to sound crazy. We weren't surprised, but we were shocked, if that makes sense. And I think because Jake had told us for so many years that there would come a day when he would no longer be there, it didn't surprise me, but it threw me into shock. I stuttered for the better part of a year. I heard lines to music, and it took me about 6 months to realize, and if this is my take on it, because I believe that whatever comes next, you're right here. You haven't gone very far away. Your energy is still very close. I really believe that. And I really believe that, that Jake's okay. I believe that he managed his depression the best that he could. And I really believe that, it's a battle. It is a battle.
After her son's death, that battle became Jeannie's too.
Admittedly, I have struggled with depression around losing my son. And I would be lying if I said that there had been times when I didn't think it wouldn't be better if I had joined him. I think it was because when you lose someone to suicide, you get to that point maybe that you have this little glimmer of understanding about what things were like for them and how they possibly could have made a decision like the ones that they made.
After sharing this part of her life story, she summarized by saying how grateful she was to have had 19 more years with her son between the time he declared the world too heavy to carry and the time he put it down. It wasn't until we asked what those nearly 2 decades of worry were like for her that she shared about the stress and pain that many caregivers carry. How does a mother, okay, I shouldn't say mother because it's anybody, how does a person, in particular, how does a parent live with that constant, and you tell me if threat is the right word, that from 7 to 26, you're aware that your son believes he will end his own life?
In all transparency, I probably didn't sleep for the better part of 19 years. We were always on edge. And Jake's suicidal ideation became more prevalent as he got older. And you are always on high alert. I would text him in the middle of the night, or, I don't know. All I can say is that you live in a world of constant anxiety and fear and terror. And if you didn't hear from there would be times when I wouldn't hear from him for 2 or 3 days. And so I would clandestinely message one of his closest friends and say, hey, have you seen Jake today? Don't tell him. He had some really good friends who knew that he was struggling, who I knew that I could trust enough to say, hey, I'm just checking in. Please don't tell him I'm helicoptering him. Because a lot of the time, I guess that's what it was helicoptering. And, I would say, hey, is he okay? Because I wouldn't hear from him for a couple days. And, then it would swing back around and, and then things would change and he'd be in a really good place for the longest time. And then the bottom would drop out in true bipolar fashion. And And when you say, how do you live like that? It is constant worry, constant fear. Every time the phone rings, you're praying that it's really your kid on the other line and not somebody who's using your kid's phone to call you and say, I have some really bad news for you. Because there was always that worry, that it would be somebody else using his phone to tell me they'd found him. So, yeah.
You doing okay?
I'm fine. Thank you.
Okay. I'm trying to think of parents listening or kids listening who could share the episode with their parents. Is there anything when you think, like if you were speaking at a school, if you were going to talk to a group of parents, what have you learned that you wish you had known that you can share with them?
Well, I did not anticipate that being your question. So what do I wish I had known? That's a hard one for me to answer, only because I had a very, and I still do, with my daughter and my stepkids. We have a very open relationship in that we don't believe that you should put flowers in sunshine where there isn't flowers in sunshine. And what I mean by that is if you see something, say something. So if I saw something going on with my kids, we addressed it immediately. And in that vein, that's what we did with Jake. It was always an open door policy so that Jake knew that if he had something he needed to share or to talk about or whatever, or if I saw him engaging in a behavior or, hibernating or whatever, we didn't just kind of brush that under the carpet and hope that it was going to go. It was always us addressing those things. And it was that way throughout his life. And I will be honest, that's probably why Jake felt comfortable saying to us, this is going to happen one day. I would encourage every single parent and every single kid to do the best that you can to have that open door policy and to not be afraid to talk about the hard stuff and to not be afraid to share the things that are scary. And to say, I don't understand it or I can't manage it. And that goes for kids and for parents because it's hard to be a parent and to watch your kid go through something.
So that is where we're going to end this episode. But remember the bumper sticker with #CheckOnYourFriends that we mentioned at the beginning? That's an effort Jeannie and her husband launched after Jake's death, and we really want to take some time to explore the amazing things that have come from that. So we will devote next week's episode to see how that open door policy is being offered to Jake's community and strangers in his honor.
So, Terry, this episode highlighted, I think, something really important, that depression and suicidal thoughts can be present from the time that a person is a child, because we often think it's just teens or adults who suffer. And I have worked with so many parents who've had these beautiful, empathic, caring children who did say very early on that they didn't want to or they didn't think that they could manage being in the world. Oh. It's really tough. And, a highly sensitive brain is going to struggle more and be impacted, I think, to a greater degree by just the difficulties and the emotional and social challenges that life brings. And I think if we identify it early on, yes, of course it can help. But in Jeannie's case, she got therapy for Jake when he was a child. Yeah. And she had that open door policy. And I think it's important for parents to know that you can do the absolute best that you can for your child, and they may still die. Ugh. And I don't think anyone wants to hear that because it's scary. It's scary as hell, but it's the truth.
Brutal truth.
It's very brutal. And some people, I think, would rather not have the open door policy or the way that Jeannie put it in the episode was that they'd rather put flowers in sunshine where there isn't flowers in sunshine, which is like, good old toxic positivity. And I think, if you have the closed door policy, that might protect a parent from who knows how many years of living with worry, but I don't think it changes the outcome. But what it does change, having a closed door policy, is how the child feels about being loved unconditionally with what they're struggling with. And I think Jeannie did this amazing thing. She chose to not add to the burden that Jake was dealing with by needing to present as fine when he wasn't. Yeah. And I think she lightened his load.
Yeah.
And the fact that it still became too heavy to carry wasn't about her. We talk all the time about how mental illness, particularly bipolar disorder, can really be one of the most challenging things that a person can ever deal with. So I think Jeannie spent 19 years aware of Jake's burden, lightening that load by carrying some of that weight for him with that open door policy. I think that's an amazing parent. And Jake's suicide was not her fault, and it wasn't his fault either.
Those are hard truths. Nobody wants to hear you can do, quote, everything right, or as right as you're able to do at any given moment, and that can still be the result. But it's not the first time we've interviewed a parent who that was their experience.
I think we need to be okay saying that. Like, that's got to get normalized somehow, too. And it doesn't mean that just because we normalize that you can't completely prevent suicide doesn't mean that we don't also do suicide prevention. It doesn't mean that everyone doesn't do what they can, but you can't judge yourself by an outcome like that. That's, like I said, it's not fair. It's not fair to anybody.
Or somebody else. It's so easy. What's wrong with that family? It's like, just seriously.
Yeah. To me, it would reduce stigma for us to understand that, yes, we're going to do all the right things. We're going to do everything we can. And yet that can still happen. Suicide can still happen. And it doesn't mean you've done anything wrong. Doesn't mean that you weren't good enough or didn't love hard enough or try to be there enough. I think people need to know that and hear that. I think there's value in that.
Thank you for speaking a really, really difficult truth. And thank you, Jeannie, for sharing your story with us and for taking that next step then and trying to turn your pain and your experience into hope for other people. And I look really forward to diving into that next week. For anyone who wants to connect with Jeannie's effort, it is #CheckOnYourFriends, and that is mostly going to be on Instagram.
We truly hope that our podcast brings a little more understanding, helps you better articulate and reflect on your own experience with depression, or better understand how to support someone else who is struggling.
If this episode has been of comfort or value to you, know that there are hundreds of others like it in our archive, which you can easily find at our website, givingvoicetodepression.com. And remember, if you're struggling, speak up, even if it's hard. If someone else is struggling, take the time to listen.